candlestick melted, but the flame never touched it. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Mystery lovers, check in, comment where you're watching from today. Reading your thoughts makes this journey unforgettable. Thank you for being here. It was a bleak December afternoon when the strange affair of the melted candlestick first entered our lives. Outside the windows of our Baker Street lodgings, London was sheathed in a fine grey mist that seemed to blur every outline and swallow every sound. The fire crackled cheerily in the hearth, but not even its warmth could dispel the ominous chill that seemed to presage an unusual case. Holmes, as ever, sat in his armchair with long fingers steepled beneath his chin and eyes half closed. Though I knew better than to suppose him asleep, the peace of that quiet hour was interrupted by the dull thud of the door-knocker below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's sharp tread on the stairs and her customary tap. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice carrying a faint note of unease. "Says he won't give his name, only that he must speak with you at once." Holmes opened his eyes. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he said simply, and a moment later a tall man with sallow features and an elegant but slightly rumpled appearance entered our sitting room. His cheeks were sunken, his gloves flecked with soot, and though no snow had yet fallen, his boots left damp prints on the rug. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked in a voice that trembled despite his obvious attempt to remain composed. "And Dr. Watson, I presume?" Holmes inclined his head. "You are in distress. Sit, if you please, and tell us what brings you here without so much as a calling card." The man took the chair opposite Holmes, clasping his gloved hands tightly in his lap. "My name is Percival Trench. I manage the household of Lord Alfred Hargrove in Belgravia. This morning a most baffling occurrence took place, something that defies natural explanation, or at least any I can conceive." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Pray continue." Trench reached into his overcoat and withdrew a parcel wrapped in thick brown paper, which he handed to Holmes. "This was discovered in the drawing-room at 8:30 this morning. It had not been there the night before. No one saw who brought it in." Holmes unwrapped the package with great care. Inside lay the twisted remains of a silver candlestick once finely wrought, now a warped half-collapsed tangle of soft metal. Yet there was no wax residue, no soot or burn mark. The base of the candlestick, too, remained unblemished, suggesting no exposure to a flame. "There was no fire?" I asked. "None, doctor. The hearth had not been lit. What's more," and here his voice lowered to a whisper, "the candlestick had been kept in a locked display cabinet in the music room." Holmes raised a brow, "And the cabinet, untouched? The lock intact, no signs of forced entry?" Holmes rose and carried the object to the window, examining it in the weak grey light. "Fascinating," he murmured. "No scorch, no discoloration. Tell me, was there anything else unusual in the house?" Mr. Trench hesitated. "Lord Hargrove was due to travel to Paris this morning. He left early, but he was perturbed. He'd received an anonymous note last night, slipped under his study door. It read only, 'What once stood tall shall bow before the flame that does not burn.'" Holmes turned, his eyes glinting. "A threat, or a riddle? Perhaps both. May I see the note?" Trench produced it from his breast pocket. Holmes scanned it, then passed it to me. The handwriting was smooth and elegant, but with an unnatural precision, like that of a practiced forger or an obsessive mind. "This is not an idle prank, Mr. Trench," Holmes said quietly. "Has Lord Hargrove enemies?" "None that I know of, but—" Trench hesitated again. "His late wife's brother, Julian Beckwith, had a falling out with him some years ago. Since Lady Hargrove's passing, there has been no contact, but Beckwith is said to harbor old resentment." Holmes nodded absently and turned back to the warped candlestick. "And you say no one entered the room? The drawing-room remains locked each night at 10. I carry the only key aside from Lord Hargrove himself. I unlocked it personally at 8 this morning." Holmes considered. "Then the object must have been brought in before the room was locked, or by someone already inside. But no servant sleeps in that part of the house," Trench replied. "And the windows are barred." "Then I shall call upon Lord Hargrove's residence today," said Holmes, wrapping the candlestick again. "There is more to this mystery than meets the eye. I suspect this is no common trick of heat or theft, but something deliberate, calculated." Miss Trench stood, relief washing over his weary face. "I'm most grateful, Mr. Holmes. I feared I would not be taken seriously. Holmes waved him off. Quite the contrary. I find the unnatural candlestick most intriguing. There is more to a melt without fire than a trick of metallurgy. Doctor, your hat. The game as ever is afoot. And so we set out into the fog of London, unaware that the twisted candlestick was but the first of several strange phenomena awaiting us in the cold shadows of Belgrave. The fog had thickened by the time we emerged onto Baker Street, wrapping itself about us like damp wool. Cab whistles echoed in the distance, and the gas lamps cast feeble yellow glows in the gloom. Holmes hailed a hansom with an impatient flick of his fingers, and we were soon rattling south toward Belgravia. He remained silent for most of the ride, eyes half-lidded and fingers drumming his knee. I knew this posture well. He was already dissecting the case in that remarkable brain of his, following paths invisible to most, but utterly clear to him. I waited until we were nearing Eaton Square before venturing a question. What do you make of it, Holmes? The candlestick, I mean. He turned his head slightly, an object of fine craftsmanship, deliberately disfigured in a manner meant to provoke attention. That it melted without any trace of flame or heat damage suggests the act was more symbolic than physical. And the note, curious phrasing, wouldn't you say? It sounded like poetry, or prophecy. Precisely, a message cloaked in metaphor. What once stood tall shall bow before the flame that does not burn. It is not merely a threat, it is a demonstration, a controlled event designed to unsettle whom? That is what we are to determine. The recipient, Lord Hargrove, was sufficiently disturbed to flee to Paris before dawn. That alone is telling. Men of means do not take flight on whim. We arrived at the Hargrove residence, a stately 4-story home, elegant yet discreet, its wrought iron gates guarding an entrance, framed by columns of pale stone. Mr. Trench was waiting for us just inside, his posture stiff, but his face brightening with visible relief at our arrival. I have taken the liberty of keeping the drawing-room undisturbed, he said, leading us through a hall adorned with ancestral portraits and heavy velvet drapes. And the display cabinet has not been touched since this morning. Holmes gave a curt nod. Good man, we shall begin there. The drawing-room was grand but somber. A pair of tall windows were veiled in gauzy curtains, and the hearth, though ready with fresh logs, remained cold. A faint scent of beeswax and old books lingered in the air. Holmes walked the perimeter slowly, pausing by the sideboard, the pianoforte and a long mahogany table before reaching the cabinet that had supposedly held the candlestick. It stood in the far corner, glass-fronted, polished to a gleam, and secured with a small brass keyhole. Mr. Trench stepped forward, producing a delicate key from his waistcoat. You said this was locked all night? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. I locked it myself shortly before 10. Holmes knelt and examined the lock, running his fingertips lightly over the surface. Then he inserted the key and opened it. Inside, the shelves were lined with fine items, porcelain vases, ivory figurines, and velvet-mounted medals. The uppermost shelf had a circular impression in the dust, clearly where the candlestick had once stood. Holmes studied the gap for a long moment. Was this the only item disturbed? To my knowledge, yes. Nothing else is missing. And the key, as I mentioned, only Lord Hargrove and I possess one. Holmes closed the cabinet and rose. Were any servants dismissed recently? No. Any visitors to the house yesterday? Mr. Trench thought for a moment. Only Lady Westercroft, Lord Hargrove's cousin. She came for tea around 4, and stayed an hour. A footman named Crickley attended the room throughout. Holmes made no reply but crossed to the window. He pulled aside the curtain, and inspected the latches. Secure, and the glass shows no signs of tampering. He turned to me then. Observe, Watson. The cabinet was locked, the room undisturbed, and yet a single item has been removed, mutilated and returned, without damage to its surroundings. This suggests, not haste, but planning, knowledge of the house's routines, familiarity with the layout, and confidence. An inside job then, or someone made to appear as such. Holmes paced slowly. We must not leap to conclusions. Tell me, Mr. Trench, do you know where Lord Hargrove spent the night? I believe at his club. He returned just after 7, appeared very agitated, then took his valet and left for the station. His instructions were brief. He said only that he required solitude and discretion. Did he mention the candlestick? He had not seen it yet. I discovered it only after his departure. Holmes glanced at the hearth. Has this fireplace been used recently? No, sir. Not in several days. Holmes knelt again, retrieving a pair of tweezers from his coat pocket. From beneath the grate he drew out a small object, a blackened scrap of something fibrous. He examined it briefly, then handed it to me. Burnt cloth, possibly, more likely silk. There are hints of embroidery. See the gold thread, a fragment of something discarded hastily. But what could it be from? We shall ask the staff. Miss Trench, bring me quickly if you please. A few minutes later, the footman entered, a nervous-looking man in his early 30s with thinning hair and ink-stained cuffs. Quickly, Holmes said, you served tea yesterday to Lady Westercroft. Yes, and were present the entire time. I was, sir. Lady Westercroft and his lordship remained in the drawing room. I served at 4:15 and cleared the tray at 5:20. Did either of them approach the display cabinet? Quickly hesitated. No, not while I was present. And after? I do not know, sir. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Do you recognize this? He held out the scrap. Quickly's eyes widened. It looks like, well, it could be from one of the silk covers we place over the silverware, but they're kept in the pantry. Holmes gave a thin smile. And yet this was found in the hearth. Curious, don't you think? I can't explain it, sir. Holmes dismissed him with a nod, and turned back to Trench. There is more here than meets the eye. I shall need to see Lord Hargrove's study. Of course. As we ascended the stairs, I leaned in. You suspect Lady Westercroft. I suspect someone wished to create an illusion, one that mimics impossibility. The melted silver, the untouched cabinet, the poetic note. It is theatre, Watson. A performance meant for one man's eyes. Lord Hargrove. Exactly. The study was a dim room, lined with books and smelling faintly of tobacco and ink. Holmes moved to the desk and examined the carpet, the chair, the ink pot. At the far end of the room, beside the writing bureau, he found a folded scrap of paper lodged behind a leg of the armchair. He unfolded it carefully, and read it aloud. It begins with silver, but ends in ash. The flame shall judge the air unworthy. He handed it to me. Another verse, another warning. But what does it mean? Holmes's eyes gleamed with intensity. That, my dear Watson, is what we are here to uncover. The melted candlestick was merely the prologue. He slipped the note into his pocket and turned for the door. Now we must pay a visit to Lady Westercroft. I suspect she may be more than a concerned cousin. I followed him, questions crowding my mind, yet already aware that in Holmes's world, no object was trivial, no phrase without intent. The game had begun in earnest. Lady Westercroft resided in a quiet cul-de-sac off Kensington Road, in a handsome townhouse, softened by ivy and smoke-smudged stone. We arrived in the early afternoon under a wan sun, attempting to pierce the lingering fog. Holmes's pace was brisk, his posture taut with anticipation. I knew the signs well. His mind had seized upon some hidden thread invisible to others, but shining bright to him. A maid answered our knock, and after a short parley, ushered us into a modest but tastefully appointed sitting room. Moments later, Lady Beatrice Westercroft appeared, a woman of perhaps 40, with pale auburn hair, fine cheekbones, and eyes that suggested both intelligence and restraint. She wore mourning grey, though her husband had been dead some 5 years. Her gaze settled on Holmes with cool appraisal. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson. I was told you are investigating a disturbance at Lord Hargrove's residence. Holmes bowed slightly, merely making inquiries into a most curious phenomenon. I understand you visited your cousin yesterday afternoon. I hadn't seen Alfred in some months. His letters grew increasingly erratic. I wished to determine whether he was, well. Holmes took the liberty of seating himself across from her, folding his long fingers on one knee. And did you find him well? A pause. He was distracted, nervous even. At one point I asked whether someone had threatened him. He denied it, but rather too quickly. Did he mention a note? No. Should he have? Indeed, a note was slipped under his study door the night of your visit, shortly before your arrival. If Miss Trench's recollection holds true, it contained an obscure warning. Her eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. That is unfortunate, but Alfred has always been a man of secrets. I presume the matter involves his late wife. Holmes raised a brow. That is a curious presumption, Lady Westercroft. Why assume it pertains to Lady Hargrove? Her lips thinned, because nearly all of Alfred's grief and guilt stems from her. Her death was untimely. Indeed, she drowned in a boating accident on their estate in Surrey, did she not? Yes. A flicker crossed her face, too fleeting to identify. That was nearly 3 years ago.
and yet I believe Alfred has never forgiven himself. Forgiven himself for what, Lady Westercroft? She met Holmes's gaze evenly, for encouraging her to go. There was a quarrel. She left in anger. The boat capsized in the shallows, and her body was found by a gardener 2 hours later. There were whispers, of course. People always whisper, but there was no evidence of foul play. Holmes inclined his head. Did you attend the inquest? No, I was abroad. Yet you imply you believe the incident affected Lord Hargrove more deeply than others realize. I do. He has become reclusive, paranoid, obsessed with omens and messages. Holmes leaned back, seemingly thoughtful. One final question. Lady Westercroft, do you possess any skill in verse? She blinked, then gave a faint smile. I dabble in poetry, Mr. Holmes. Why? Merely curious. Thank you for your time. We took our leave shortly thereafter. As we stepped into the cool street, I ventured a glance at my companion. You don't believe her. I believe she told the truth, as much of it as suited her, but not all of it. Holmes gave a faint grunt. Did you observe how she avoided speaking of Julian Beckwith? I frowned. She never mentioned him. Precisely. We walked in silence for several minutes. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing a brittle gray sky above the rooftops. Holmes hailed another cab and gave the driver directions to the British Library. Back to research, I asked, to verify a suspicion. The wording of those notes, what once stood tall shall bow before the flame that does not burn, and now, the flame shall judge the air unworthy. They echo something, not merely a poetic mind at work, but an intertextual one. As we rode, Holmes fell into one of his deep silences. By the time we arrived, he was out of the cab before I could gather my coat. Within the hushed vaults of the library, Holmes consulted an index with furious speed, his long fingers flipping through catalogues, until he retrieved a slim volume of obscure poetry. He opened it, scanned a page, then handed it to me. The Flame Unseen by Alaric Dunthorne. I read aloud, published in 1869. Holmes tapped a stanza on the opened page. What once stood tall shall bow in dread. To silent fire the proud are led. The flame unseen, the trial begun. When silver weeps, and airs shall run. I stared. The same phrasing, nearly word for word. Indeed, Alaric Dunthorne, a forgotten romantic poet. His work was never widely read, but copies still exist in certain circles, which begs the question, who among our cast of characters is familiar with obscure verse? Lady Westercroft, or someone very close to her. I suspect this is not the first time she's referenced it. He closed the book. Now, back to Belgravia, back to Belgravia, back to Bel.
It was late afternoon when we returned to the Hargrove residence. Mr. Trench received us at once, his brow furrowed. I've just received a telegram from Lord Hargrove, he said. He's staying at the Hotel d'Almont in Paris. He has requested that the candlestick be sent to him immediately by private courier. Holmes's brows rose. Indeed, that seems hasty. He said only that he must examine it himself. I thought it prudent to await your advice before dispatching it. You were right to do so. Do nothing yet. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall the fragment I found in the hearth? Yes. Embroidered silk. We shall now inspect the pantry. To Trench's evident confusion, Holmes insisted on being shown the linen stores. In the narrow, cool space where silverware and cloths were kept, he searched swiftly but with care. He soon found what he sought, a set of silk cloths used for covering the silver. All were intact, save one. A place had been left vacant, the impression in the linen stack visible where something had been removed. One is missing, Holmes murmured, which means someone entered this pantry, removed a cloth, used it for some purpose connected to the candlestick, and then burned the evidence. But why? I asked. Because the cloth may have borne initials or livery markings, traceable to this household. By burning it, the culprit sought to erase any link between the object and their actions. Holmes stood and turned to Trent. Has Julian Beckwith ever been to this house since Lady Hargrove's death? Not that I know of. Find out. And send a message to Lord Hargrove. Request that he delay examining the candlestick until I have completed my inquiries. Mr. Trench nodded and disappeared up the stairs. Holmes turned back to me. his expression animated. Someone is staging a reckoning, Watson. These messages, these symbolic acts, they form a deliberate structure, not unlike a play, with each act bringing us closer to a revelation. Whoever is behind it knows the Hargrove family history intimately, and wants something from him, or wants something to be known. As we stepped back into the dim hallway, the light caught a shimmer of glass on a small side table. Another candlestick, its twin undisturbed. Holmes reached out and tilted it slightly. At its base was a tiny smear of something pale and waxy. Not wax, he murmured. Resin, perhaps, phosphorus compound. He said no more, but I could see that something had clicked into place in his mind, some crucial link between science and symbolism, between family and flame. And I knew then that the mystery was far from over. Holmes said little during the ride, save for one cryptic remark as we passed Charing Cross. The theatre of revenge, Watson, often opens with symbolism, but it ends in truth. When we reached our lodgings, he immediately requested the chemical kit and withdrew to his laboratory table, placing the pale smear from the second candlestick onto a glass slide. I busied myself with notes compiling what we had learned thus far, but my pen stilled the moment Holmes uttered a short, sharp exclamation. Just as I suspected, traces of white phosphorus combined with a gum-based binder. An old chemical trick, Watson, used by certain illusionists to create what they called cold fire. No flame in the traditional sense, but capable of slowly eating through soft metals when paired with acids and moisture. Ingenious and extremely dangerous. So the candlestick was sabotaged in such a manner. Undoubtedly, it would have appeared untouched for hours until the compound began its work. The result, a melted, disfigured object with no sign of fire. The perfect illusion of impossible destruction. But what purpose would such a deception serve? That, Holmes said, placing down the slide with care, remains the critical question. This was not a warning of physical harm. It was a performance, a message disguised as mystery. The candlestick's destruction, combined with the poetic verse, speaks not of violence, but of judgment. Someone believes Lord Hargrove guilty of something. They wish to force a confession or extract penance, related to his wife's death. Holmes didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached for his pipe and struck a match, his eyes narrowing behind the haze of blue smoke. There is something wrong at the heart of this family. Too many silences, too many convenient absences. Lady Westercroft speaks with precision, but reveals nothing. And Julian Beckwith entirely absent, yet ever present in implication. I shifted in my chair. Perhaps Beckwith is the one sending these notes. Perhaps, but consider why now. Why the theatricality? Why the poetry? No, Watson, I believe we are dealing with someone who sees themselves not merely as an avenger, but as an artist of moral reckoning. And they are not finished. Just then a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with an envelope on a silver tray. A boy delivered it, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Holmes took the envelope, weighed it in his hand, and opened it. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. Written in the same elegant hand as before was another stanza. The second flame shall fall tonight, where secrets hide from morning light. By silver's twin, the ash shall spread, and guilt shall speak where silence bled. He read it twice before handing it to me. This is no idle threat, he said, rising at once. It is an announcement, but what does it mean? Holmes was already at the coat stand. It means the next act is set to unfold. By silver's twin, we already saw its mate in Hargrove's hallway. The next target is not symbolic, it is real, and it will happen tonight. Then we must return there at once. No, Holmes paused, eyes sharp. We shall do better. We shall wait. He paced rapidly, mind working faster than I could follow. The Hargrove household will be watched. Whoever has orchestrated this intends to strike again. But this time we shall be present unseen. Within the hour we had returned to Belgravia, slipping into the rear of the Hargrove residence under cover of dusk. Mr. Trench, though surprised, gave us access to the servants' passageway. Holmes selected a small dark room off the main corridor, adjacent to the hall where the second candlestick stood. We extinguished the lamps and waited in silence. The minutes passed slowly.
The only sound the distant tick of the drawing room clock. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, likely trench or a servant, but otherwise the house remained still. Then shortly after 10 we heard it, the faintest rustle, a door opening and closing with precision, soft, deliberate footsteps on the thick carpet. Holmes touched my arm lightly, then peered through the barely cracked door. I glimpsed a shadow, tall, cloaked, moving down the corridor. The figure paused by the side table, then bent low, obscuring the candlestick from view. A faint clink of metal against glass. Holmes stepped out soundlessly and advanced. "Stop where you are," he said coolly. The figure froze, then turned slowly. A woman. Even in the low light I recognized the sharp lines of Lady Westercroft's face, though now she wore a dark traveling cloak and glove. Holmes lit the wall sconce beside him. Her face was pale but composed. "You're quick, Mr. Holmes, but perhaps not quick enough." He stepped forward, retrieving a small glass vial she had just placed beside the candlestick. Its stopper was wet. "Phosphoric acid," he said, "the companion to the resin. You intended to begin the second flame." She gave a slight nod. "It was never meant to harm anyone, only to force him to speak." "What truth do you seek, Lady Westercroft?" She exhaled slowly. "The truth about my sister's death. I believe." "Your sister?" "Yes," she said softly. "Eleanor Hargrove was my younger sister. She married Alfred against my counsel. I warned her he was prideful and secretive. After her death, after the boat was found drifting, her body bruised and waterlogged, I asked questions quietly, discreetly, but the more I pressed, the more walls I encountered. Julian tried too, my cousin, but he was dismissed as unstable." Holmes's voice was calm. "And so you became judge and author of your own inquest." "The law would do nothing," she said, eyes glinting. "The inquest found it an accident, but I read her letters. I pieced together her final days. She was afraid. She wrote of arguments, of threats. And you decided to break him." "No, I decided to confront him with truth wrapped in symbols he could not ignore." He was a devotee of Dunthorne's poetry in his youth. I remembered. I used his own obsessions to lead him back to guilt. Holmes's eyes did not soften. "And the cabinet, the deception with the lock, easily picked. I was careful. I took the candlestick late at night, dissolved the resin earlier that day, and returned it before morning. Alfred never thought to question his own security." I glanced at Holmes. "She committed no theft, no violence. What will you do?" Holmes sighed, his gaze fixed on the glistening acid vial. "Justice is not always served through courts, Watson. Sometimes it emerges through courage and risk." He turned to her. "You will cease these performances. No more fire, no more verse." She nodded. "It is done. He has fled." The next letter was to be final, a confession or exposure. Holmes handed her the vial. "Destroy this. Leave the rest to conscience and memory." She departed in silence, her footsteps vanishing like smoke into the hall. We remained a moment longer. Holmes replaced the candlestick and adjusted his coat. "A woman of rare discipline," he murmured. "And pain. And Lord Hargrove. He will not remain in Paris long. When he returns I shall speak with him. But I believe the candlesticks will do their work better than any constable." As we stepped into the fog-bound night once more, Holmes offered a final musing. "Not all flames consume, Watson. Some illumine." The street outside Lord Hargrove's residence lay swaddled in mist, thick as velvet, as Holmes and I walked slowly away, our boots striking hollow notes on the paving stones. Neither of us spoke for some time. Holmes's brow was drawn, and though the immediate drama had ended without violence, I sensed that his mind remained unsatisfied, as though the play had lost none of its complexity simply because the second act had been interrupted. "I do not believe," he said at last, his voice low and precise, "that Lady Westercroft acted alone." I turned to him in surprise, but she confessed. "The candlestick, the poetry, the entire scheme, it was her design." "Yes, Watson, but you must note the distinction between design and execution." He quickened his pace, eyes flashing as his thoughts coalesced aloud. "Her presence tonight, the acid, the resin, those were her acts. But the first note, the acid, the resin, those were her acts. But the first note, the placement of the melted candlestick, the poetic meter precisely matching a rarely published stanza. I examined her earlier. She is intelligent, yes, but that degree of literary fidelity suggested a source beyond her. You think someone aided her. I think someone directed her, or at the very least encouraged her actions while remaining unseen. There is a ghost still lurking in the Hargrove narrative, Watson, and I intend to uncover it. We arrived back at Baker Street close to midnight. Holmes lit the fire and removed his overcoat without haste, then strode to the sideboard, where he poured himself 2 fingers of brandy and handed me a glass. I must know more about Julian Beckwith, he said. His absence is too pronounced, too precisely timed. His quarrel with Lord Hargrove, his sister's death, and now Lady Westercroft's crusade. He is a shadow over all of it. You think he's behind the poetic threats. I suspect he laid the foundation, and once again I intend to begin where the facts are fewest. Watson, would you be so good as to locate the Evening Chronicle from 3 years past, June and July editions, the weeks following Lady Hargrove's death? While I retrieved the bound volumes from the shelf and settled into the chair with my notebook, Holmes began composing a telegram to Superintendent Giles, Surrey Division. Request all public records and inquest documentation pertaining to Eleanor Hargrove, née Westercroft, deceased June 28. He dispatched it via messenger and returned to the hearth. Begin with June 29. I flipped through the yellowed pages, scanning the small headlines. After several fruitless columns: murders, bank failures, railway accidents, I found a short entry dated July. Lady Hargrove, wife of Lord Alfred Hargrove, tragically drowned on the private grounds of their Surrey estate. Foul play is not suspected. The inquest concluded the death was accidental. A brief memorial will be held at St. Luke's Chapel. Holmes read over my shoulder, then tapped the next column. Local eccentric Julian Beckwith, brother-in-law to Lord Hargrove, was reportedly removed from the estate, following an outburst, during private family discussions. It is understood he accused an unnamed party of impropriety. There, Holmes murmured, the fissure. He stood abruptly and began pacing. Lady Westercroft said nothing of Julian's presence during the funeral, because she was not there, but he was, and he accused Hargrove, likely of murder, or something close to it. Then why disappear? Perhaps he was silenced, or perhaps he chose exile until such time as guilt might be coaxed into the light. I sat back. If Lady Westercroft was the hand, Beckwith may have been the voice behind it. Holmes's gaze drifted to the window where the first flurries of snow danced in the gaslight, or the pen. Those verses, Watson, precise, measured, and unmistakably authored by someone steeped in poetic discipline. Beckwith was known to be a writer in his youth. I recall reviewing a pamphlet of essays, attributed to a J.B., on metaphysical symbolism. They bore striking resemblance to the verses we've seen. He crossed to the bookshelf and withdrew a thin volume bound in blue. Here, Thoughts in the Dust, Essays on the Invisible Aesthetic, self-published, Julian Beckwith. He read aloud a passage, when fire ceases to warm and begins instead to judge, it speaks not to the flesh, but to the soul. It is flame transfigured, no longer heat, but meaning. I met his gaze. You believe Beckwith authored the notes? Whether he placed them himself, or merely passed them to Beatrice to deploy, is the remaining mystery. A knock interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered with a sealed envelope, marked with the official crest of Scotland Yard. Holmes opened it swiftly. His eyes scanned the contents, and he gave a curt nod. As I expected, the inquest was a quiet affair, managed by a local magistrate with little appetite for controversy. Beckwith submitted a written statement alleging coercion and manipulation of his sister, but it was dismissed as hearsay. No autopsy was ordered. I felt a chill deeper than the winter air. And now, Holmes said, moving to the map pinned above the fireplace, we go to Surrey. The following morning, bundled against the cold, we boarded the early train south, disembarking at the quiet village near the Hargrove estate. The land had changed little in the intervening years. Bare trees, hedgerows dusted in frost, the scent of wood smoke and wet loam in the air. Holmes led the way through the narrow lane, and soon the manor came into view, ivy strangled, weather-beaten, its windows shuttered. A solitary caretaker named Mr. Greaves received us at the gate, startled by our presence, but pliable once Holmes introduced himself. We asked to see the lake. It lay half frozen now, ringed with skeletal reeds, the boathouse sagging under the weight of years. Holmes surveyed it carefully, moving to the edge where the jetty met the shore. There, he pointed. See how the wooden planks differ. 2 were replaced. Greaves nodded. After the accident, yes. Lord Hargrove ordered them repaired, said the boards had rotted through. Holmes knelt and examined the beams. Not rot, scorch. These were burned, and covered with fresh boards. I blinked. Burned. Here. Holmes turned, the wind tousling his hair. What if the accident was staged? The flame unseen. An allegory. Yes, but also a truth. Fire perhaps used to loosen the boards beneath the boat. Not enough to cause alarm immediately, but enough to ensure disaster. But that would require planning, and knowledge of where she'd go. And motive, Watson. Always motive. He stood, dusted off his knees, and faced the caretaker. Mr. Greaves, do you recall anyone frequenting the estate after Lady Hargrove's death? Specifically a man tall, thin, with fair hair and a limp. Greaves frowned. That sounds like Mr. Beckwith. Came by once, maybe twice. Years ago. Asked after the garden paths. Spent a whole morning by the lake, silent as a monk. Did he say anything? Only this: truth never drowns. It waits. Then he left. Holmes's eyes shone. Indeed it does. We left the estate as snow began to fall in earnest, returning to London with more questions than answers, but also with the shape of the truth beginning to rise from beneath the surface. The candlesticks, the verses, the fire, they were not separate puzzles. They were fragments of a single voice, and that voice, long silenced, was beginning to speak, was beginning to speak, was beginning to...
The train rocked gently as we made our way back to London. The snow now falling in great muffling sheets against the carriage windows. Holmes sat motionless across from me, legs stretched, his steepled fingers resting lightly against his lips. His eyes, half shuttered, revealed little, but I could tell from the subtle twitch of his right hand that the machinery of his mind was whirring at full tilt. I reviewed my notes quietly, but the image of those scorched planks at the lake's edge haunted me. Lady Hargrove's death, once attributed to cold water and a moment's misfortune, now seemed more like a calculated disappearance. And if it had indeed been engineered, it had been done so with intent, skill, and a chilling patience. Holmes spoke at last. We are dealing, Watson, not merely with a single act of vengeance or grief, but with a composition, a design unfolding in parts. Each element, chemical, poetic, symbolic, is too deliberate to be the work of accident or emotion alone. Julian Beckwith, or someone carrying out his vision, Holmes replied, not lifting his gaze. It may yet be Beatrice Westercroft, though I now doubt she acted with full understanding of her own role. She strikes me as intelligent, certainly, but susceptible to persuasion cloaked as truth. I looked out the window at the blurring countryside. You think Beckwith manipulated her? I think Beckwith, if alive, has orchestrated a great deal more than we've yet seen. His silence is too structured. He's not hiding from fear but from necessity. The train hissed into Victoria Station, and within the hour we were back at Baker Street. The fire had been laid and glowed invitingly. Holmes removed his coat, but rather than settling in, he crossed to his desk and retrieved a folded map of London. He laid it flat and placed a pin in Eaton Square, then another at Kensington Road, a third at the Hargrove country estate in Surrey. A triangle of influence, he murmured, each point representing a site of psychological impact. Belgravia for status, Kensington for memory, Surrey for guilt. The next act must occur in the one place untouched thus far, the past. He turned sharply. Watson, fetch that folder from the bottom drawer marked Westercroft Archives. I handed it to him, and he leafed through until he pulled out a thin, dog-eared letter, written by Eleanor Hargrove to Julian, a month before her death. Obtained by discreet request, you may recall. He read aloud, I dread the silences, Julian. He speaks less each day, and when he does, there is a new weight behind his word. The silver he polishes so obsessively now, always those candlesticks, as though they hold some meaning only he can see. I fear they are more than heirlooms. They are symbols to him of something earned or taken. Holmes looked up. Even she sensed the madness then germinating in Hargrave. A fixation not on the objects themselves but on what they represented. Inheritance, legacy, power. Do you believe she threatened to leave him? I believe she did, and I believe he ensured she would not. At that moment Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. Holmes took it wordlessly and scanned it. His expression sharpened. It's from Superintendent Giles in Surrey. Julian Beckwith was spotted 2 weeks ago boarding a mail steamer at Portsmouth under the name James Bellamy. Destination Jersey. The Channel Islands. Then he's fled. No, Holmes said, folding the telegram. He's waiting. He rose again, pulled on his coat, and gestured for mine. We go to the Westercroft townhouse. I have a notion that Lady Westercroft's involvement is not concluded, despite what she believed. The townhouse was quiet when we arrived, its iron gate shut against the snow. A maid answered our knock and led us once again to the sitting room, where Lady Beatrice sat with a letter in her hand, her face pale and composed. You came quickly, she said without preamble. Holmes inclined his head. You expected me. I expected someone. This arrived half an hour ago. She handed it to him. The envelope bore no stamp, no postmark, hand-delivered. Inside, a single sheet of cream paper, with the now familiar calligraphy. When silver bows and fire fades, one truth shall rise through shadowed glades. Where roots were torn, the soil shall speak. The final verse is yours to seek. Holmes read it aloud slowly, then looked up. Do you know what it means? She nodded once, lips trembling. Yes. The Westercroft family chapel. It lies on our old estate in Derbyshire. The roots, he means the graves. Your parents are buried there. And Ellen, a marker was placed beside them, though her body was never interred there. Alfred had her cremated. Holmes's eyes narrowed, unusual for a Hargrove, given their family traditions. Eleanor hated pomp. She asked for it in her will. Did she? Holmes asked quiet. Lady Westercroft looked startled. Are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, but I intend to learn everything. We left immediately, for St. John's Cross, the Westercroft ancestral grounds, traveling by special trains secured through Holmes's influence. Snow swirled across the countryside, lending a haunted stillness to the hedgerows and bare fields. By dusk, we arrived at the gatehouse, long unused, its iron bars rusted and overgrown. Holmes led the way up the path, past tangled brambles and wind-blown stones, until we reached the old family chapel, grey stone, half sunken into the hill, its door sagging but intact. A lantern hung by the entrance, inexplicably lit. We exchanged a glance and stepped inside. The air within was still and cold. Dust lay thick across the pews. At the far end beneath the altar stood a row of memorial plaques. Holmes strode to them, lantern held high. One bore Eleanor Hargrove's name. He knelt, examined the ground before it, then tapped a flagstone lightly with his cane. A hollow note answered, "Help me, Watson." Together we pried up the stone. Beneath, a small iron box rested in a shallow cavity. Holmes lifted it free, and broke the clasp with a twist of his blade. Inside, letters, dozens, all in Eleanor's hand. He read one aloud, a single page, dated 2 days before her death. Julian, if you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I fear Alfred. He speaks of silence as virtue, and shame as weakness. He told me last night that the river cleanses more than the soul. I will not run, not yet, but if I vanish, do not believe what he says. My life is in his hands, and he has already dropped it once. A silence fell over us. When Holmes rose, his face was grim. She left this for Beckwith, and he retrieved it. These verses, these flames, this entire campaign, it has been to bring this truth to light, but not through violence, through confession. You mean Beckwith never meant to kill or expose anyone directly, only to pressure Hargrove into doing so himself. We stood quietly in that cold chapel. Then Holmes replaced the box, resealed the stone, and extinguished the lantern. The final verse has been written, Watson. Now we must wait for the reader to speak. We departed the chapel under a vault of leaden sky, the last light of day swallowed by snow-draped hills, and the creaking hush of the ancient woods. Holmes walked ahead, hands clasped behind his back, boots crunching with metronomic precision. I followed in silence, understanding instinctively that he was retracing thoughts as well as footsteps. We did not speak again until we reached the frozen path leading back to the gatehouse. Truth, Watson, he said abruptly, has its own peculiar rhythm. It does not burst forth when demanded. It emerges when the final chord is struck, when all the players have reached their mark. Tonight, I believe, the final note will sound. We returned to London by the overnight train, the journey long and largely silent. Holmes remained fixed in contemplation, his eyes closed not in rest, but in abstraction. As for myself, my thoughts kept circling the contents of that iron box, those letters written by a woman fully aware of her doom, composed with clarity and grace, and without any certainty they would ever be read. By the time we arrived back at Baker Street, the city had awakened under a pale dawn, the snow had ceased, but the air remained sharp. As we stepped inside, a telegram lay waiting for us on the hall table, its seal broken already by Mrs. Hudson, I presume. Holmes read it without comment, then passed it to me. To Mr. Holmes. Lord Hargrove has returned unexpectedly from Paris, arrived this morning, appears agitated, has requested solitude in his study. Percival Trench. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, with sudden purpose, he seized his coat again. Come, Watson, our final movement awaits. Within the hour we stood once more on the marble threshold of the Hargrove residence. Mr. Trench greeted us with a tense nod, and led us directly to the study. Holmes raised a hand to forestall his knock, and gestured that we would enter unannounced. We stepped inside. Lord Hargrove sat at his desk, the unopened parcel containing the melted candlestick before him. He was thinner than I remembered, his face drawn and his eyes hollowed, though they remained fierce with the old pride. A fire crackled in the grate, but the heat seemed not to touch him. He looked up slowly, expression unreadable. I suppose, he said hoarsely, that I should not be surprised. Holmes moved forward with deliberate calm. You've read the final note. I have. And you understand it. I do. I stepped closer, studying him more closely. His right hand trembled slightly, though he did not seek to conceal it. His gaze fixed on Holmes with the tight, detached stare of a man who had come to the precipice of something, and found no turning back. Holmes remained silent for a beat longer, then spoke with the quiet gravity of a man handing down a verdict. There is no law that compels confession, Lord Hargrove, but silence is no longer an option. You are not merely pursued, you are, if not by the courts, then by the one person whose judgment has always mattered most. For a moment, I thought Hargrove would lash out, his lips parted as if to protest, but then his shoulders sagged, and something behind his eyes gave way. I never meant to kill her, he said. The words were whispered, not to us, but to the empty room. Holmes said nothing. I stood still, scarcely breathing. Hargrove's voice came again, now bitter with memory. She had written a letter, said she was leaving, that she would expose me, my financial dealings, my affairs, my failings. She said I no longer had her trust, and I couldn't allow that. Not then. I had built everything. Everything. Her name, her silence. It was part of it all. He rose abruptly and walked to the fire, gripping the mantle as though it steadied him. I confronted her at the lake, told her she could not destroy me. She laughed, said it was already done. I told her to go take her little boat, row to the far end, and clear her head, like she used to. And when she did, he swallowed hard. I'd treated the boards that morning, not to kill her, God, no, but to frighten her, to show her she was not in control. I thought the boat would take on water, tip, maybe force her to swim back, but she struck her head, or panicked. When I saw the body, his voice broke, he turned away. I had the gardener fetch her, told the staff nothing, claimed she had gone out alone. Later I told the inquest it was accidental. No one doubted me. Holmes moved only slightly, and Julian Beckwith, he accused me at once. I dismissed him, paid off the magistrate to keep it quiet. When he returned some months later, I had him barred from the estate. And the letters, I thought I'd destroyed them all. Clearly, I was mistaken. Holmes nodded once. No, you were merely incomplete, as all secrets are.
Hargrove turned, eyes burning with fatigue and something else, perhaps regret. So, will you hand me over to the police? Holmes regarded him with something like cold pity. You will write a letter. You will detail everything, not for the law but for Eleanor's family, for Lady Westercroft, for Beckwith, wherever he is. That is your penance. Whether you choose to live with it, is your affair. Hargrove stared at him, then with slow resolution, he sat back down and reached for his pen. We left him there, in that silent room, the fire burning low, the weight of his words beginning to settle. Outside, the sun broke through the thinning clouds for the first time in days. As we stepped into the street, Holmes drew a deep breath and pulled his collar high. No man, he said softly, can burn away guilt. Sooner or later, it reconstitutes itself, in verse, in ash, in silence. I looked at him, struck by the gravity in his tone. Do you believe justice was done? I believe truth was spoken, he replied. In cases such as this, that is often the more powerful sentence. We walked on through the hush of the morning, the mist retreating slowly behind us, and though the case was nearing its end, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, perhaps in Jersey, perhaps even closer, Julian Beckwith was watching, and waiting, not for vengeance, but for vindication, and at long last, he had it. The early afternoon found us back at Baker Street, the streets outside still slick with thawing snow. The coal fire hissed quietly in the grate, while Holmes stood by the window, one hand against the frame, eyes distant. I said nothing at first, knowing his silences often marked moments of transition, when the investigation ceased to be a puzzle, and became instead, a reckoning. He finally turned to me. It is a curious sensation, Watson, to watch a man sentence himself. I looked up from my note. Do you believe he will carry it through? Write the letter. I mean, he will, and not for our sake. The mind that carries guilt unburdened for years, must in the end, find a container, if not confession, then madness. But Hargrove is not mad, merely hollowed out. I leaned back, letting his words settle. There was a finality to the case now, though not the kind that left one with satisfaction. It was not the thunder of courtroom verdicts, or the clink of handcuffs. Rather it was the quieter, more unsettling closure that came when guilt had no escape, and truth was too late to save anyone. A knock at the door roused us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it with a flick of the wrist and read it quickly. His brow tightened. It's from Giles again. New information on Beckwith. He handed it to me as he returned to the window. Julian Beckwith, returned from Channel Islands 2 nights ago, booked into Langham Hotel under alias J. Bellamy, left yesterday morning, not seen. He's back in London, I said, scanning the brief note again. Holmes nodded, just long enough to be certain the last act had been played. You think he watched us? I think he watched Hargrove, perhaps even witnessed his return. Beckwith is a man who has labored years to arrange a reckoning that could not be traced to him. Now that the truth has surfaced, he has no more reason to remain. His vengeance is complete, not in blood, but in exposure. I poured myself a brandy and offered one to Holmes, which he declined. Do you think he'll ever resurface? Perhaps, in poetry, in ink, but not in person. Julian Beckwith struck me as a man who values the power of being unseen. I sipped in silence, my mind tracing back over the path we'd taken, each clue, each stanza, each carefully planted flame. It had not been a typical case. There had been no killer at large, no chase through alleys or shootouts in dim stairwells, and yet it had felt darker in some ways, more intimate. I was about to speak when the bell rang again. This time the visitor entered with Holmes's sum. Lady Westercroft was dressed in black, her veil lifted, her expression unreadable. She carried a small box, no bigger than a prayer book, tied with blue ribbon. Holmes greeted her gently. You've come from Hargrove's. She nodded, her voice soft. He gave me. Holmes gestured for her to sit and untied the ribbon, with practiced care. Inside were several folded pages, Hargrove's handwriting, unmistakable. There was also a slim, leather-bound book. A confession, I asked. A beginning. Lady Westercroft answered. He asked me to deliver it to Julian, should I find him, and to leave him be. Holmes picked up the leather book. The spine bore no title, but when he opened it, he smiled faintly. Dunthorne, he murmured. The flame unseen. Hargrove's own annotated copy, underlined verses, marginalia. He's offering it back to the source, a symbolic gesture. And the letter? I asked. Lady Westercroft did not answer immediately. Her fingers were tightly entwined in her lap. He speaks of Eleanor, of his shame. He doesn't ask forgiveness, only that she be remembered for who she was, not how she died. Holmes closed the book and placed it beside the letter. Then that is something. She nodded. I believe I shall go abroad for a time. Switzerland, perhaps. The snow there feels less cruel. She rose, and Holmes saw her to the door. Before leaving, she turned to him. Julian will never write back, you know. He has always believed silence to be the final word. Holmes inclined his head, but not the last one. When she had gone, Holmes returned to the armchair and lit his pipe. The room was quiet again. The room was quiet again. The room was quiet.
It was early evening when the final piece of the story arrived. A messenger boy, soaked and shivering, brought an envelope bearing no name, only the number 2021B. Holmes took it, tipped the boy, and opened it carefully. Inside, a single slip of paper, thick, vellum-like, and faintly scented with cedar. No name, no signature, just a short stanza in the same elegant hand as before. Now flame is ash, and silver still. Let silence have its chosen will. Not all that dies has met its end. Some truths, like ghosts, are what we send. Holmes read it, then passed it to me. I felt a strange chill. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition of a mind that had walked among us and now, having completed its design, vanished like smoke through a keyhole. So that's it then, I said. Yes, Watson, that's it. I glanced at him. You don't look relieved. He was quiet for a moment, then said, We uncovered the truth, but we did not prevent the tragedy. This was a case where justice wore no badge and spoke in no court, a reckoning by verse, by conscience, by design. And Eleanor, she is no longer voiceless. That is something at least. We sat in companionable silence as the lamplight flickered against the walls. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and quiet. Holmes rose at last, crossed to the fireplace, and added another log. Then almost absently he said, Do you recall, Watson, what Beckwith said to the groundskeeper? Truth never drowns, it waits. Holmes nodded. Indeed, and now it waits no longer. He turned, settled back into his chair, and with a long, slow exhale, closed his eyes. And so the case of the candlestick that melted without heat came to its strange and quiet end. Not with the clang of irons, but with the soft thud of a sealed letter, and the lingering echo of a poem long forgotten, now finally understood. The following days passed in a curious limbo. The fire burned steadily in our sitting room, a soft antidote to the chill that lingered outside. But inside Holmes something remained unsettled. He busied himself with trivial cases, a misplaced necklace here, a blackmail attempt foiled there. But his mind always seemed to drift. I would catch him staring at the fireplace with an expression I could not read, or tracing invisible lines in the air, as if calculating the angles of something no longer visible. I knew better than to press him. Holmes did not dwell unless there remained a thread left unwound, and though Hargrove had confessed and Lady Westercroft had withdrawn, though Beckwith had written his final verse and faded into silence, Holmes remained fixed on a point just out of reach. It was on the fourth morning after the case's conclusion that it came. A knock, a letter, a signature we hadn't seen before, but one that brought Holmes fully upright as soon as he read it. He passed it to me without a word. Mr. Holmes, your investigation has completed its arc, but there remains an epilogue, as in all good tragedy. If you would know it, come alone to number 6, Alderney Row, Wapping, tonight at 9. No police, no Watson, no deception, only the last of the ashes. J.B., I looked up sharply. He's here, in London. Holmes nodded once, and waiting to complete the work. I set the letter down. You cannot go alone. I must, Holmes said evenly. He's made it clear. This meeting is not one of confrontation. It is coda, the final note. If I bring another voice, the melody breaks. But it could be dangerous. A faint smile touched his lip. If Julian Beckwith had intended danger, He would never have chosen verse as his weapon. The rest of the day passed in a low, coiled tension. Holmes made no effort to conceal his preparations, but they were few. A small notebook, a clean handkerchief, no pistol. When the time came, he departed quietly, leaving me by the fire with a firm instruction: do not follow. I didn't, but I did not rest. The hours crawled by, the ticking of the mantel clock, a metronome to my worry. I poured 2 brandies but drank only 1. I read the newspaper without absorbing a word. Finally, when the hands neared midnight, I heard the latch turn. Holmes stepped inside, snow on his coat and a strange stillness about him. Not shaken, but altered, in some quiet way. I stood. You're back. As you see, what happened? He removed his gloves slowly and sat. I found Julian Beckwith precisely as he intended, waiting, alone, in the upper room of a former print shop by the docks. Spartan furnishings, an oil lamp, 1 chair for himself, 1 for me. No drama, no speeches. He asked me to sit. I did. He paused, eyes on the fire. Then he told me the rest. I waited. He was never certain what Alfred had done. Only that Eleanor had written to him of fear, of anger. That she was going to confront her husband. When the news came that she had drowned, that her body was burned, that the inquest was hushed, he felt a truth had been buried without words. Holmes reached into his coat and removed a folded page. He handed it to me. Beckwith's hand. Another. Let silver weep and candles fail, for silence seals what courts curtail. No judgment passed by crown or blade may weigh as much as vows betrayed. He wrote that, Holmes said, the night he left the estate for good. It was not meant for Eleanor or Hargrove. It was meant for himself, a compact. That he would not pursue vengeance in the usual sense, but instead hold vigil, watch, wait, and if time revealed nothing, then nothing would be done. But it did. I said. Yes. Holmes replied. Lady Westercroft in her grief opened the door. She asked the questions he had grown tired of shouting. When she found the letters he had hidden in the chapel wall years before, when she read Eleanor's words, it was as though the fire had kindled again. She took up his cause, but in her own way. The candlestick, the poetry, the threats, they were her tools, not his. She played the part he could no longer bear. So why summon you now? Holmes looked into the fire. Because he wished to thank me, not for revealing the truth, but for giving it shape. He said it mattered that it was spoken, that it had weight beyond suspicion, that it had witnesses, that Eleanor would no longer be remembered only as a woman who died mysteriously, but as a woman who trusted, feared, and ultimately tried to fight back. He fell silent, and for a moment I could hear only the coal shifting in the hearth. Then I asked, what will he do now? Holmes drew a breath. He said he would leave London by morning. I believe him. He has lived in shadow for too long, but he left something for Lady Westercroft. He reached into his coat once more, and pulled free a small envelope, an original poem, titled simply, Ashes. He said she would know what to do with it. He stood and placed the letter on the mantel. Will you give it to her? I asked. In time, Holmes said. Not yet. She needs peace first. We said no more. Holmes retired not long after, but I remained by the fire, watching the flames curl around the last of the coals. The case in all its strange poetry had closed without fanfare. No arrests, no public declarations, no headlines. Just 2 siblings, each haunted by the same death, each seeking something the world would never return. And Holmes, who had once remarked that murder was seldom about hate and more often about fear, had now witnessed a different kind of reckoning, one without handcuffs or hangmen, but no less binding. The candlestick that melted without heat had led us, not to a murderer on the run, but to a deeper truth, one born of grief, born by silence and finally set free in the quiet language of verse. As I rose to retire, I glanced once more at Beckwith's last note, still resting on the table, and in the hush of Baker Street I found myself murmuring the final line aloud. Some truths, like ghosts, are what we send. London moved on as it always did. Carriages rolled through slush-clogged lanes, chimney smoke curled into colorless skies, and the newspapers once more filled their pages with trifles. A jewel theft in Mayfair, a scandal in Parliament, a fog-related collision by the dock. Of the Hargrove affair, there was not a whisper. Holmes had ensured it,
Though outwardly composed, I sensed Holmes remained entangled in the final strands of the case. He spoke little, his responses clipped, and he spent long hours seated at the window, violin cradled in his lap, but unplayed. The letter Beckwith had left for Lady Westercroft remained untouched on the mantel, sealed and silent. On the third evening, I found Holmes still at the hearth, staring at the flames as though expecting them to speak. I crossed to the sideboard, poured us both a measure of whiskey, and handed him a glass. He accepted it wordlessly, then at last spoke, his tone low and unhurried. "Do you recall, Watson, what Lady Westercroft said about her sister's aversion to ceremony?" I nodded. "She said Eleanor preferred simplicity, that cremation had been her own request." Holmes set down the glass. "And yet, Eleanor Hargrove was buried in layers of performance. Not in a coffin, but in silence, in careful omissions. Her name became a placeholder for tragedy rather than a person." He turned to face me fully. "Truth in this case has been less about discovering a killer, and more about restoring the shape of a person's life. Beckwith understood that. And Lady Westercroft, she carried the burden not of vengeance, but of memory." He rose suddenly and went to the mantel. Without flourish, he picked up the letter Beckwith had left and turned it in his hands. "It is time," he said simply. We took a cab across the river, the streets darker than usual, gaslight dimmed by the low-hanging mist. We passed the colonnaded facade of the Old Bailey, the Thames rolling silent beside us, and finally turned onto a narrow lane off King's Road, where Lady Westercroft had taken temporary lodging before departing the country. She answered the door herself, dressed plainly, her hair pinned in a modest style. The weariness in her eyes had not vanished, but something softer now lay beside it. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Her voice was calm, almost warm. "I hoped you would come." Holmes offered the envelope. "A final communication from your brother. He entrusted it to me." She took it with both hands, her breath catching. For a moment she stood very still, eyes closed, then opened the seal. She did not read it aloud. When she reached the end, her hand trembled, and she brought the letter to her chest. "He signs it with her name," she said after a moment. "Not his." Holmes inclined his head. She looked up, tears brimming but unshed. "Then the circle is closed." He nodded again. "There is one more thing." From his coat pocket he withdrew a folded page. It was Eleanor's final letter, the one retrieved from the chapel, the letter she had left for Beckwith. "I believe," Holmes said, "that you should keep this." She took it with reverence, not unfolding it. Her eyes met Holmes's. "You've given me more than answers. You've returned my sister to me, not in life, but in truth." Holmes bowed slightly. "That is all we may ever hope to do." She did not ask where Beckwith had gone, nor did we offer it. Some questions belonged to the realm of silence. As we left her standing in the warm threshold of her home, the letter in one hand, and her sister's words in the other, I saw in her the first flicker of peace. We returned to Baker Street in silence. The fire had burned low, the room cast in amber shadows. Holmes removed his coat and sat again in the chair opposite mine. I expected him to pick up his violin at last, to ease the weight that always settled after such cases. Instead he spoke. "You know, Watson, I have often said that logic must rule the detective's mind, that sentiment is an enemy to truth." "I remember," I said, "but occasionally," he continued, voice quieter, "one finds a case where sentiment is not a hindrance, but a key, not emotion for its own sake, but the deep memory of loss, and the insistence that loss be acknowledged." He turned to the fire. "Beckwith never sought fame, nor punishment. He wished only that someone say her name again, truthfully, that her life not be reduced to a convenient fiction. And in that," I said, "he succeeded." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Yes, he succeeded." A quiet settled over us again, but it was no longer the weighty silence of unresolved question. It was the stillness that comes after a long storm has passed, when the ground is soaked, but the air begins to clear. The clock struck midnight. Holmes stirred only slightly, and for the first time in days he reached for his violin. He drew the bow across the strings, coaxing a low, mournful note that lingered in the room like fog over the Thames. The melody that followed was slow, deliberate, and strangely beautiful, not a performance but a benediction. I listened in silence, not daring to interrupt. When he finished, he laid the violin aside, and looked toward the window, where the frost had begun to gather once more. "Some cases," he said, change nothing, but remind us why we began. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. The fire crackled once more, and the shadows danced quietly across the walls of 201B, as if moved, not by heat, but by the ghost of a truth, long buried, and finally brought into light. The following week passed with the gentle rhythm of normalcy restored. The fire in our sitting room burned a little brighter. Holmes returned to his familiar habits. Newspapers splayed across the table, scraps of paper with hurried ciphered notes, and I resumed my clinic visits, with a mind more at ease. There had been no further word from Julian Beckwith, nor from Lady Westercroft, and Holmes made no inquiry. It was as though the case had been folded away, not forgotten, but one foggy afternoon, as I entered our lodgings with an armful of correspondence and the latest Times, I found Holmes seated cross-legged on the divan, a single envelope in his lap. He glanced up. "From Wapping," he said, answering the question before I asked it. "A quiet farewell." He handed me the letter, and I read, "Mr. Holmes, you need not seek me. The shape of the truth has settled, and with it so have I. Eleanor's memory lies not in stone, nor in scandal, but in the echo that remains once the shouting fades. You and Dr. Watson have granted her that echo. Do not mourn me. I have lived longer in shadows than most do in light. That is enough. J.B." There was no address, no date, only the slanting script of a man who had chosen his part in the story and left the stage before the applause or the judgment could begin. Holmes folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer and closed it with finality. "It is over," he said simply. Yet that evening, over our modest supper, he elaborated as he so often did once the facts had been sifted, measured, and stored. "Do you know why this case will stay with me, Watson?" he asked, staring into his tea rather than drinking it. "Because it lacked your usual outcome," I suggested. "No arrest, no trial, no theatrical confrontation. No, because every clue led not to a person's crime, but to a person's pain. The candlestick, the poetry, the silence. It was a trail not of evidence, but of emotion, and yet every detail was logical. Each element bore weight. It was deduction drawn from grief." He paused, folding his fingers. "Too often, we chase the one who pulled the trigger, yet forget the hand that loaded it. Hargrove's guilt was not only in action, but in arrogance, his belief that status could insulate him from consequence, and Beckwith's justice, subtle as it was, stripped that illusion away." I nodded, remembering the warped candlestick, the verse that haunted our nights, and the hollow man at his desk writing a confession, not to Scotland Yard, but to memory itself. "And Eleanor?" I asked softly. Holmes looked up, his eyes unreadable. "She reminded us that the voiceless are not without influence, that a single page, carefully hidden, can unravel a fortress of lies. Her truth, Watson, was not in how she died, but in how she tried to live." The hour grew late, and London outside turned once again to shadow. As Holmes returned to his violin, playing something plaintive and delicate, I sat back and thought of all we had seen, a flame that melted metal without fire, verses carved into memory, and a family slowly unwinding its own carefully maintained fiction. And I realized, as I often did, that Holmes had once more solved more than a mystery. He had restored something that time and silence had conspired to erase. That, I believe, was the true end of the case of the candlestick, that melted without heat. And in that end, there was something rare in our shared profession, not merely justice, but quiet dignity restored. Quiet dignity restored. Quiet dignity